Okay, tonight we're going to talk about Parshas LECH-LECHA, and we're going to talk about some technical points. First, the idea of bris, the idea of a covenant. In this week's parasha, we find two episodes of bris, two covenants that God makes with Avram. The first is called the bris bein habesarim. It's the covenant between the halves of animals. The ritual that was the formal making of the covenant involved taking a certain number of animals and slicing them in two and arranging them on two sides of a path. And Avram and the Ribono Shel Olam walked on this path, and that symbolizes the covenant. The symbolism seems to be, on the most simple level, that what really is a covenant? A covenant is an agreement that makes two into one. Now, marriage is a covenant. Husband and wife become one. So here, how do you symbolize that? You take an animal and you slice it in two. So really the two halves of the animal really are one animal. So that really is symbolic of the two parties to the covenant. The two parties to the covenant really are one, but they are separated by space, by distance. But really they become one through the covenant. So that's the symbolism of using a split animal. This was the ritual of covenant, the bris bein habesarim. And in this covenant, God promised Eretz Yisrael to Avraham Avinu. What did Avraham give in return? Nothing. When we read the Psukim, it doesn't seem that there was any exchange. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes promises to Avraham. Avraham doesn't give anything in return to the Ribono Shel Olam, which raises the question, why is it called a bris? In other words, it could be called a promise, it could be called an oath, perhaps, but if it's unilateral, it's not a covenant. A covenant, by definition, has to be an exchange. Each side gives and gets. So in the case of the bris bein habesarim, it's hard to understand how it's called a bris at all. The Torah calls it a bris. It says, Bayom Ahu, on that day, Karas Hashem es Avram bris. Hashem made a bris with Avram. But if you read the Psukim, it doesn't seem that Avram gives anything. We'll come back to this a little bit later. Later in the parasha, many years later, there's a second covenant, which is the covenant of bris milah. Well, here, it does seem that Avram is giving something. He's committing himself to this mitzvah, which certainly involves discomfort and pain. And in exchange, Hashem again promises him Eretz Yisrael. And the question, of course, is that you can't keep selling the same bridge. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu can't give it again and again and again. Each time, there must be something which is added to the promise. The Ramban points out that these two covenants really are preceded in the parsha by two promises, which are not covenants. When Avram first arrives in Eretz Yisrael, Hashem promises Eretz Yisrael to Avram. Later, after Avram and his nephew Lot part ways, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises Eretz Yisrael to Avram. Now, those two are not called covenants. The word bris is not used in those two situations. Those are promises. Then we have the two covenants, the bris bein habesarim and the bris milah. But it comes out in the parasha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises Eretz Yisrael to Avram 4 times. So again and again and again and again, what is Hashem adding with each additional promise? So the Ramban says as follows. The Ramban says the first time, when Avram first arrives in Eretz Yisrael, Hashem tells him, "L'zarocha nasati es haaretz hazos." To your children I have given this land. That's it. The land isn't defined. The borders aren't defined. It's just a promise of Eretz Yisrael. In the second promise, we already have an idea that we're talking about something which is quite vast. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avram in the second promise to lift up his eyes, look to the north, south, east, west, as far as you can see, it's given to you and your children. And the Ramban understands from Chazal that we're not talking about what Avram could see with his eyes of flesh, but rather HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Avram Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, to be able to see all the way to the ends of the Eretz Yisrael. So the first promise is a limited promise. I will give you this land, but this land may mean the immediate vicinity. The second promise already is a promise of a vast land, vast Eretz Yisrael. But, says the Ramban, the first two promises are not necessarily unconditional. There is no absolute commitment. Perhaps the gift of Eretz Yisrael will be conditional upon merit, on deserving it. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes the third overture to Avram, at that point Avram asks a question. And he says, B'mo eidak ki irashena. How do I know that I will eventually inherit Eretz Yisrael? And although the Gemara calls this a lack of faith, but the Rishonim, Rashi and the Ramban, try to explain that it wasn't really a lack of faith. Avram was asking a very simple question. That if the promise is contingent upon merit, who says that my descendants will be deserving? So again, let's get this point clear. The first two promises, there was no explicit condition. God never said explicitly that the gift of Eretz Yisrael is conditional upon deserving it, but he didn't say otherwise either. So the presumption is, I'm going to give you Eretz Yisrael if you deserve it. So the third time, Avram asks the question, how do I know? And Rashi and Ramban explain, how do I know that my descendants will be deserving? Maybe over the years, they'll become corrupted, and they won't be deserving. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a bris. And implicit in the concept of bris is that it's absolute. There's nothing that can abrogate the bris. Nothing that the Jewish people could do will prevent them from getting Eretz Yisrael. So that's a big addition over the first two promises. The first two promises weren't absolute promises. Maybe they were conditional upon merit. The third promise is called a bris because it's a covenant, it's a contract. It can't be violated. We're going to receive Eretz Yisrael whether we are deserving or not. What is the fourth promise coming to add? The promise of the bris milah. So the Ramban points out that if you look in the parsha of bris milah, God tells Avram there that I will give you Eretz Yisrael as an achuzas olam, an eternal possession. And the Ramban says that means that even if someday you are exiled from it, there is a promise that you'll return. That's what the fourth promise adds, that even if we are exiled, we will come back. Now, this is hard to understand, because if the gift of Eretz Yisrael, as articulated in the third promise, is that we're going to get it even if we're not deserving, then how could we be exiled? On what grounds would we be exiled? If the gift of Eretz Yisrael is an unconditional gift, it's ours whether we are deserving or not, so what could possibly result in our being exiled for it, that we have to have a fourth promise that even if we're exiled, we're going to come back? In other words, if the gift of Eretz Yisrael is conditional on deserving it, on merit, then I understand that we could be exiled if we are no longer deserving of it. But if the initial promise is unconditional, whether we're deserving or not, we're going to get it, so what conditions could bring about our being exiled that we need a fourth promise that even if we're exiled, we're going to come back? I mean, such a thing shouldn't happen. We should never be exiled if the promise is an unconditional promise. So that's the first question. How do we understand the third and fourth promises? If the third promise is an unconditional promise, that means we're going to get Eretz Yisrael even if we're not deserving. What could the conditions be that would result in our being exiled, that we need the fourth promise, that even if we're exiled, we're going to be led back? That's the first question. Or better, that's the second question. The first question was that in what sense is the bris ben Abasarim called the bris, after all said and done, Avram didn't give anything to God in exchange. It's not a contract. It's not a covenant. It's a unilateral promise on God's part. So why would we call that a bris? That was the first question. The second question is, how do we understand the relationship of the third and the fourth promises? Again, if the third promise is an unconditional gift, how could we be exiled that we would then need to invoke the fourth promise that even if we're exiled, we'll be brought back? Now, let's look at the psukim, the verses, in a little more detail. It says that God appears to Avram, and he says, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord, Asher Hotzeisicha miUr Kasdim, who took you forth from Ur Kasdim, that was Avram's original home, LECH-LECHA es ha'aretz hazos l'rishta, in order to give you this land as an inheritance. So God reveals himself to Avram. I am the Lord who took you from the Far East and brought you to Eretz Yisrael with the intention of giving you this land. So, no promises. Statement of fact. I took you from the Far East, I brought you here with the intention of giving you this land. At that point, Avram asks, B'mo eidak hi Hashem. How do I know? How do I know? Now, Avram, again, has already received promises earlier in the story, but presumably those promises are conditional on merit, so he wants to know that, how do I know? Maybe my descendants won't be deserving. So God tells him, take animals. Take a calf, and a goat, and a ram, various birds, and cut them in two, and this ritual takes place. Then it says, Vayi Hashemesh Lavo, that the sun was about to set. V'sardema nafla al Avram, and a very deep sleep fell on Avram. And of course, this means he's about to have a prophetic experience, a very profound prophetic experience. And God tells him, you should know that you're going to be a stranger in a strange land for many years. You'll be enslaved and tortured for 400 years. But the nation that enslaves you will be punished, and you will leave with great wealth. And this is God telling Avram, informing Avram of the Egyptian enslavement. And then it says that Bayom Ahu, that day, Hashem made the covenant, and he said, L'zaracha nasati es ha'aretz hazos, to your children I've given this land, all the way from the Har Mitzrayim, all the way from Egypt until the Euphrates River, the land of 10 nations. And that's the story in a nutshell. What is going on? Avram asked the question, how do I know I'll inherit the land? And Hashem tells him, take animals, and he tells him about the Egyptian servitude, and he makes a covenant. Like, what is the connection? What is the flow? It seems that the elements of the story are disjointed. We have two basic approaches. We have Rashi's approach, and we have the Ramban's approach. Because Rashi's approach is that God was answering the question. Because your question was, in what merit will your children possess Eretz Yisrael? Maybe they'll be undeserving. The answer is in the merit of korbanos, in the merit of sacrifices. And Avram's taking all of these animals was symbolic of the sacrifices that someday would be brought in the Beis HaMikdash. And that's the answer to your question. If your question is, how do you know? Meaning, maybe your descendants will be undeserving. The answer is no, because there'll be a Beis HaMikdash, they'll bring korbanos, they'll be deserving. But there's a little bit of a problem. The fact you asked the question is improper. It wasn't a correct thing to do, to doubt God. You should have taken my promise at face value. And therefore there's a punishment. What will the punishment be? That your descendants are going to be enslaved for 100 years. And therefore this bit of information, which God told Avram, according to Rashi, has nothing to do with the covenant per se, nothing to do with the gift of Eretz Yisrael. It's interjected here because it's God informing Avram that because you asked the question, therefore there's a punishment. The punishment will be 400 years of servitude. Then we get back on track, and God formalizes the promise and says you're going to have the gift of 10 nations and the entire lands from the Euphrates all the way to the Nahal Mitzrayim, the river of Egypt. Now again, it's a very difficult approach to the parsha. Essentially, Rashi says that this foretelling of the Egyptian servitude is an interjection. It really has nothing to do with the subject of the discussion, which is Eretz Yisrael and our deserving Eretz Yisrael. It's really just put in there to tell Avraham that there'll be a punishment for asking the question. That's the Rashi's approach. The Ramban has a different approach. The Ramban says that really it's part of the promise. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu is promising Eretz Yisrael to Avraham, but that Avraham shouldn't have a misconception and think that the promise will be fulfilled immediately. God just informs him, as a matter of fact, you should know it's not going to happen right away. It's only going to happen after 400 years. And that's why it's interjected. So according to the Ramban, it's really a bit of added information within the covenant. Because God is making the promise to Avraham that you're going to get Eretz Yisrael, but you should know it's not going to be immediate. It'll only be after 400 years. Those are the two basic approaches to the parsha. Both of them, perhaps one could argue, are a little bit unsatisfying. I think there may be a third approach to understanding the Psukim, in which the Egyptian servitude is essential to the promise of Eretz Yisrael. Let me explain what I mean. Because we are accustomed to thinking that we are deserving of that which God gives us for our good deeds. If we do mitzvahs, we learn Torah, we do the right thing, so we become deserving of God's blessings. If we, God forbid, do averis, we do the wrong thing, we don't learn Torah, we don't daven, we don't do mitzvahs, we don't give tzedakah, then we're not deserving, and to the contrary, we may be deserving of punishments. So the only consideration which is taken into account is the extent to which we do the right thing or the extent to which we do the wrong thing. The reality is that is a very, very incomplete analysis of things. There are many people, I believe, that come to this world not for the purpose of making good choices. Their purpose, their mission in life is fulfilled not through the choices they make, but through the experiences over which they do not have control. Now, let me give you a very, very simple example of this. In the case of young children who are born and experience illness and suffering and may die as children. Because what is the significance and meaning of those lives? They never reached a point of maturity where they could make actual choices, do mitzvahs, be responsible for their deeds, do averis. They come to this world as infants. They may be born with congenital conditions. They may contract terrible diseases. They experience a life of suffering. And they pass on long before they could possibly have made choices or decisions or done good deeds or done averis. So how do we understand the meaning of their lives? On what basis do they go to Olam Haba? Do they go to Olam Haba? Do they experience the bliss of the world to come? How do we understand it? I think it's very, very simple. I mean, not very simple. I can't pinpoint and tell you that in every instance this is why it happened, and this is why it happened, and why it happened. But in terms of the overall scheme of things, there are many people who are brought into this world because the world needs people that have these experiences and suffer in these ways in order to create a challenge for the rest of us. I've said many times in this class that if you were to ask me as a Torontonian, what is the one thing that I'm proud of in Toronto? So the answer I always give is a sick kids hospital. Because what's the idea? It's a magnificent place. We should never need it. But the idea that a community, a city, a province, has devoted millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, resources, to the development of a center to help sick children is a tremendous schus, a tremendous merit for a community. Think of the other things that could have been done with that money. The province could have sunk it into all sorts of enterprises. And believe me, there's plenty of money they're wasting in any case. But nevertheless, a lot of that money was well invested into something which was very, very, very significant. That challenge.
Children's Hospital in Ottawa.
Pardon?
There's a Children's Hospital in Ottawa.
I'll tell you,
so that doesn't have much merit?
I'm not familiar with Ottawa. I said, as a Torontonian, I live here, right? If I was in Ottawa,
people in Ottawa have the same merit.
they could say the same thing. They say the same thing. I'm not familiar with Ottawa. I've only visited, never been there. But the point I'm making is that challenge. Are we going to devote our resources to helping sick children? Or are we going to devote our resources to something frivolous? To create that challenge, you have to have sick children. If there were not sick children in the world, then as a society we would not be challenged with that choice. We would not build hospitals for sick children if there were no sick children. If there were no poor people, we wouldn't have the challenge of tzedakah. The Medrash says this, that once a certain Roman official asked Rabbi Akiva that if God loves the poor people so much, God tells us, take care of them and give them charity and support them, so why doesn't God support them himself? Good question. So Rabbi Akiva answered, the reason that God doesn't support them is so that through our charity we should be spared from the judgments of Gehenna. We should be spared from the judgments of Gehenna. That means we need to have the opportunities to give charity. It's a big test. Will we rise to the challenge and give tzedakah? We'll not rise to the challenge. But what creates the challenge is poor people. There have to be poor people in the world. Why? Because otherwise there'd be no challenge. So when you see a poor person, you can't point the finger and say, oh, what sin must he have committed that he's so poor and so needy and so dependent on our help? Not necessarily so. The reason he's poor, perhaps, is not because he committed a sin. He's poor because there have to be poor people. Because even in a world where everyone was perfectly righteous, there would have to be poor people. Why? Because otherwise there'd be no opportunity for tzedakah. There'd be no challenge of tzedakah. So everyone is given a job in this world. And therefore, I think this is true for every person. There are certain aspects of our lives which are not consequences of reward and punishment. For example, where you're born. Some people are born in very vibrant Jewish communities where they're the beneficiaries of institutions and schools and so on and so forth. Some people are born in places where the opportunities are minimal. Obviously, where you're born is not a function of merit. You can't say, I deserve to be born in a good place, and that person didn't deserve to be born in a good place. He was born in a lousy place. You can't say that, because before you're born, you don't have any merits or demerits. As God selected for you, this is the place you're going to be born, and this is the place you're going to be born, because every person is put into a unique situation. Every person is born into a unique historical period. Why are some people born in the 21st century, and some people are born in the 10th century? There are certain comforts and conveniences we have today which didn't exist 1,000 years ago. No running water, no air conditioning, no computers, no iPhones, nothing. So why was it that they had to live such a deprived... Not, of course, that they missed it. Right? They had no idea what they were missing. But nevertheless, they didn't have these comforts, and we have these conveniences. What's the answer? The answer is, it has nothing to do with merit. If you're born into a specific historical period, that's not because you were deserving. That's because that's what God chose for you. And God chose something else for that person. And each person's circumstances are designed to be a custom fit for that person's soul, that person's nature. And it's only with being deserving. Now, obviously, there are certain aspects of my life which will be related to reward and punishment. That's why we know Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment. And part of the judgment certainly is the weighing of our mitzvahs and our averos, because there could be certain other aspects of life which are a function of what I deserve. But there are certainly some aspects of life which are not. And I think for some individuals, those children, for example, they come to this world And for them, there are really no considerations of reward and punishment. Or they are given a mission to have certain experiences, to be in certain times, certain places, to go through certain things that pose challenges for their parents, for their communities, for the entire Jewish nation, which either we will respond to in a positive way or not. Or either we will respond with our kindness, with our prayer, with our concern, or we may not. But that's the explanation and the meaning of those people's lives. The irony is that those children, never having made decisions, never having done mitzvahs necessarily, we can say emphatically, have lived successful lives. They did exactly what they were meant to do. They were put in this world for a purpose, they fulfilled their purpose. Those of us who reach adulthood, and we are challenged, are we going to do mitzvahs, are we going to do averos, are we going to learn Torah, are we going to do the right thing, are we going to be good people? We can't say the same thing with the confidence. Because since our mission in life apparently is to make choices, we've come to that point in life where we are able to make choices. Can we say with a certainty we've made good choices? Always? 10% of the time, 20%, 30%, 50% of the time? Maybe yes, maybe no. We can't say with a certainty. So we may be in for a big surprise after 120 years. And we're going to come up to heaven, and God will say, well, let's see. You were sent to this world to make choices, and let's see what type of choices you made. Good choices, bad choices. And our fate will be a function of that. Whereas these individuals who were sent to the world not to make choices, they will fulfill their purpose, and they will be welcomed through the pearly gates to the bliss of the world to come, no questions asked.
But are these individuals, the young ones, are they any different from a rock or a blade of grass? In other words, yes, the rock has a purpose and the blade of grass has a purpose, so how can you suggest that these individuals fulfill a purpose?
Because they've suffered. They've suffered. In other words, they've earned their bliss not for making good choices, they've earned it for suffering. They've suffered to fulfill God's ends. So therefore it's only just that they be paid for that. The rack is a rack. It's true, the rack fulfills its purpose, but there's no rack heaven, right? The rack didn't suffer in fulfilling its purpose, and therefore there's no reason it should be paid back, right? The human being who comes to this world and suffers to fulfill the divine purpose, right, it has to be compensated. So therefore you can get Olam Haba in one of two ways. You can get Olam Haba through the good choices you make, doing the right thing, good deeds. You can get it for suffering to achieve God's purposes. So those children would be examples of individuals who earn it through suffering, yes?
So you're only talking about children. What about adults that suffered in various...
That's what I'm saying, exactly. In other words, I'm only using children as the example because in the case of children, it's certainly the case. Because they never reach the age where they are of responsibility. But I think the same thing could be true with adults. I think that there may be adults that find themselves in situations where certain aspects of their lives are not functions of reward and punishment. It's not that they've earned this, but rather they are subjected to certain circumstances because this is part of the divine plan. It has to be. And therefore, they will be richly rewarded in the next world for having achieved it, even though it's not that they made relevant choices. I personally think, one second, that this probably is the answer to much suffering which takes place in the world. Now let's talk about the Holocaust for a minute, just as an example of the most horrific example of suffering in modern times. Now we know that the Holocaust was a historic series of events which totally redirected the course of Jewish history. redirected the course of Jewish history. In other words, Jewish history was traveling one path and totally changed direction as a consequence of the Holocaust. In some ways that we would consider absolutely necessary for the continued survival of the Jewish people. In other words, there is this tendency to glorify the past and say that everything was great in Europe until the Nazis came along. It's a mistake. It's a mistake. The truth is that the intermarriage rates, for example, in Germany in the 1920s, were the same as the intermarriage rates in North America today. Wow. About 70%. In other words, in the aftermath of the First World War, there was a massive secularization of Jewish communities in Europe, massive assimilation, certainly in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, not to the same extent because of the tremendous anti-Semitism, but there was a great decline in Jewish life, practice, education, and so on and so forth that was taking place in Europe. There are people who have lived through that period and have written that had the Holocaust not happened, we would have had another Holocaust. Very much like the Holocaust that we are facing in North America today. We're dealing with a situation where assimilation is rampant, intermarriage is rampant. You would think that there should be some population growth, in and among Jews, and yet you find that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, the number of Jews in North America has, if not declined, certainly leveled off, which is a very perplexing thing, because you would think that the population over a generation, there should be some amount of natural increase. And the answer is because at the same time that there are certain segments of the community that are multiplying like rabbits, there are other segments of the community that are writing themselves out of existence. So when you put it all together, it kind of levels off. But the truth is that if we didn't have the tremendous growth in certain segments of the community, we'd have an actual precipitous decline of people that would identify themselves as Jews. And this was the case before the Holocaust. The Holocaust changed everything, at least temporarily. In other words, it created a sense of the imperative of continued Jewish survival. It certainly was the event that led to the establishment of the State of Israel, and so on and so forth. And there's no need for me to describe the way this was historically transformed. Now, the Holocaust poses a very, very great theological question, right? Which is that how do we understand the deaths of 6 million Jews? Certainly, that type of death on such a large scale, it can't be explained with the usual answers that people were deserving and there was this sin and this crime. It was a death which didn't discriminate between what type of Jew and where you're from and what your ideology was and what your philosophy was and whether you were a Zionist, whether you were an anti-Zionist. It didn't differentiate. So how do you understand that? Yes?
I got a question regarding the Holocaust. You're saying that the Holocaust was necessary to improve Yiddishkeit, but it didn't improve Yiddishkeit. So what did it do? It didn't.
To the contrary.
I mean, you're saying the situation in North America is worse than the West.
The contrary. We gained, number one, a half a century. We gained a half a century. Number two, we gained a very, very, very vibrant, committed community, which is a consequence of the outgrowth of the Holocaust. I mean, the example that Sfarim bring is really like this. It's like an amputation, right? Sometimes you amputate an organ and it saves the person. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the person is better off without the leg? Well, in many ways, he's not better off without the leg. He's missing the leg. but his continued survival is guaranteed. And this is many great Rabbanim have written that essentially the Holocaust was a sense of habitation. But the question is that to look for sins to say that this person was deserving and this person was deserving is first of all it's futile, and secondly it's blasphemous to say that we're going to identify the sins that individuals committed. I think the ultimate answer is going to be that sometimes people are sent to this world not to make choices, but they are meant to be players in the historical drama, right, which in turn guides the course of history and brings about God's plan for history. And in the next world, these people who suffered for that purpose will be richly, richly rewarded, not necessarily because they made good choices or bad choices, etc., but because for their suffering. When you suffer to achieve God's ends, so then you'll be richly rewarded. And when I say richly rewarded, I mean richly rewarded to the extent that people would be knocking on the doors to get that opportunity if they only knew. In other words, the Olam Haba, the eternal bliss, which the victims of the Holocaust will certainly experience, it would be something that anybody that would understand it and know it would gladly trade away life itself in order to achieve. It would be worthwhile. Because we don't see it as worthwhile because we don't understand what the bliss of the world to come is. Right? But if we could have a glimpse of the world to come, God would say, all you have to do to experience this, to have this eternal bliss, is to be a martyr, to accomplish the divine purpose in history. People would opt for it. People would want it. People would think it was a worthwhile trade. Question?
So this, one of the basic principles that we understand in Yiddishkeit is that of free will. And this describes a whole segment of humanity that virtually doesn't have free will. Because they're not making choices.
Let me make this clear.
The little babies are not
making choices. We're talking about free will, right? The principle of free will means that to the extent that you are held responsible for what you do, that is predicated on the fact that you have free will, right? But we know there are things that happen to people, right, that are not a function of their free will. They don't choose for them to happen, right? In other words, it's true. If you are being punished for something you did, or if you're being rewarded for something you did, it must have been something that you did or didn't do, expressing your free will. That is true. So to the extent that the Torah does tell us, yes, there is schar, there is einish, there is reward, there is punishment, then obviously there must be a gift of free will. That doesn't mean necessarily that everything that happens to a person is a consequence of his free will. Right? There are things that happen to a person that just happen, right? In which case he will not be responsible for them, right? But he may be rewarded for them, right? If God brought them about to accomplish some greater purpose, and now you have to be paid back in the world to come, or maybe even in this world.
So regardless of what that person does, he is a player in this.
I think that's true in any case. I'm not saying anything which I think we don't all intuit as being true. Because we all know that we are parts of a drama which is unfolding in this world. And sometimes the roles we play, we choose for ourselves. We write our own scripts. And sometimes we don't write our own scripts. Sometimes we are just inadvertent players in that drama. And that's the way it is. But you still may get paid for your service.
So God decides what's going on. The ultimate decision is Him.
Well, we all believe that anyway, right?
Okay.
God guides course of
so
history.
We have semi-free will, okay? But when we decide not to decide, we also make a decision, but we get rewarded for what's deemed to be good decisions and penalized for what seems to be bad decisions as far as somebody else is concerned.
That's something that's true. It's like this, that in the areas of your life which are subject to your control, there will be reward and punishment. That's certainly true. In other words, if there's something in your life that you are in control of, then you make the right choices, you'll be richly rewarded. You make bad choices, God forbid, the opposite. But in those areas of your life in which you are not in control, there's really nothing you could do, then it may be that those are aspects of reward and punishment. That could be. But it could be that it's just because at this juncture of history, this is what needs to happen. And you've been chosen to be that agent in history, and if that involves suffering, you'll be paid richly for it, right? Even though you had no choice in bringing it on yourself.
You're making a connection that I don't quite follow, that you're saying someone is suffering and they're going to be richly rewarded for suffering, but suffering in some ways is a choice. I mean, someone who's very poor, by definition, it doesn't mean that they're suffering. It's how there's very happy poor people. There's also very sad, very rich people.
100%, 100%.
But you're making,
that certainly your mental attitude towards suffering is one of those things in which you are in control of. And it's true. It could very well be that every person who experiences suffering in life will ultimately be judged for his positive or negative mental attitude. But the question is this, that the person's death, right, is not a free will choice. He didn't choose to die, right? He might have chosen to have a good attitude or a bad attitude up to that point, but his death he didn't choose. So does that mean that his death was something he earned, he deserved? Not necessarily. Because it could be that at this particular juncture of history, it was necessary for this person to die, right? It's part of the divine plan. And accordingly, if he ended up living not as long as he would have otherwise deserved, there'll have to be a compensation for that. It's only fair.
The question I was asking is, if somebody is poor, just using that as an example, and they don't suffer, they accept that that's their lot in life, and they're happy with it. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Because it sounds like you're saying that they'll be richly rewarded for the suffering.
Look, a person should always make the most out of a situation. I'll agree with you. But you're not going to tell me that being poor is as good as being rich. Right? In other words, this poor person, at the same time that he makes the most of the situation and he smiles and he's happy, right, probably would be better off if he had food to eat.
I don't think we can say that.
Let me tell you, I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to you.
Someone started.
I'll prove it to you, right? God says in the Torah that if you do the mitzvahs, you'll be rewarded with wealth and prosperity and good health and peace, right? And if you do aveiros, there'll be poverty and suffering and war and so on and so forth. Now the question is, you're saying like this, that really, what difference does it make? It's all a question of attitude, right? No, it's not a question of attitude. God says not like that. God says there are certain things that are good. It's good to have peace, it's good to be healthy, it's good to have money. And these things are good. And therefore those are rewards for doing good things. And it's bad to be sick and poor and at war and miserable. And therefore those are punishments. Right?
But God defined good and bad.
Now that means
war is bad. Right?
It's bad.
He says poor is bad.
It is
but
bad.
Sometimes the rich person has more obligations to the world than the poor guy. The rich man knows more, may know more, and
listen.
Therefore,
what would you rather be, rich or poor?
Question is, would you rather be healthy or sick?
Would you rather be healthy or sick?
So I'd rather be healthy.
Good. Would you
and
rather
I'd
be rich
rather
or poor?
be happy.
Rich or poor?
Well, it depends upon what you can define as rich and poor.
Okay, I'll tell you. I'll stick my neck out. I'd rather rich than poor. Right?
But rich in what way?
In
what way?
I'll take my chances. I'll take my chances. I'll be rich and I'll be charitable and I'll be content and I won't become conceited. Test me, try me. Right? I won't let it go to my head. That's the point. In other words, but that's what the Torah says. The Torah says it's not a question that everything is the same, it's all a question of your attitude. Right? The Torah itself says that these are good things, these are bad things. Yeah, you're right. Sometimes a person could be very wealthy and he can bring misery upon himself. And sometimes the poor person can be very, very happy-go-lucky and have a very, very, very content life. But as a rule, generally,
bad, absolute or relative? They're relative, depending upon who you are and what you are. It may be that war is good if I want that property, or I don't like those.
When this class is over, I want your wallet, okay?
I understand. And that's what I'm saying to you.
I think.
I'm not
look,
disagreeing with you.
I think.
What's the relative? Good or bad?
I think we can say like this: that good things can be corrupted,
Yes.
and bad things can be,
Have some merit.
maximized, right? But as a rule, there are certain things that tend to be better than others, right? And therefore, people strive for them; they want them, and rightfully so. And the Torah itself validates that. Now, I think that the answer to all the questions we have is exactly this. Back to our parsha. Avraham Avinu was promised on 2 occasions Eretz Yisrael. Right? When he first arrived in Eretz Yisrael, God said, I'm giving you this land. Later, after Lot's departure, God said, lift up your eyes, look to the north, south, east, west. As far as you can see, it's yours. At that point, Avraham Avinu thought that it's contingent upon merit. Because generally, that's how things are. If you deserve it, you get it. You don't deserve it, you won't get it. So that opens the great question that, okay, Avraham himself may have been confident in his own merit, but what about his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren? Maybe they wouldn't be deserving. Okay? So the third time, when God gives him the entryway, and God says, I am the Lord who took you out of Ur Kasdim, and I brought you to Eretz Yisrael to give you this land, so Avraham asks the $64,000 question, which is, how do I know? So presumably the promise is conditional on merit, and okay, even if I'm fairly confident in my own merit, but how do I know that my children, my descendants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren will remain deserving? Maybe they won't be deserving. God answers the question. He says, you're making a big mistake. He says, you're not going to get Eretz Yisrael because you deserve it. You're going to get Eretz Yisrael because you suffered. That's exactly the answer. Yado Ateda, you should know that the Jewish people are going to be enslaved in Egypt. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to be, first of all, foreigners in a strange land. They're going to be enslaved, and they're going to be tortured. They're going to be tortured by a kingdom from which no slave ever was liberated. And miraculously, in a demonstration of God's might, of God's power, you're going to be redeemed, not just redeemed, but redeemed with great wealth. And that is going to demonstrate for all time God's majesty, God's power, His omnipotence, etc., etc., etc. The suffering of the Jewish people in those 400 years really is to create the demonstration that the Exodus will be. If the Exodus is meant to be a demonstration of God, as we all know from the Chumash, if you read the Parshias of Shemos, of Bo, right, the issue that God repeats again and again and again is that I'm performing these miracles so that Paro and all mankind will know that I am the Lord. And this is the basis of the religious faith for all eternity. The miracles,
God made a contract. Something
wait,
of value
what's
transpired. The suffering is of value. Just as the offerings, right? So God did make a contract.
Right. Well, let's hold your horses. We're getting there. Right?
Okay,
so the point is this, that God told Abraham that you're making a big mistake. You're asking the question, how do I know? Because you're assuming that the gift of Eretz Yisrael is because of your being deserving, because you've done good deeds. So you have a question, how do I know that my grandchildren will do good deeds? Maybe they'll become corrupted. So that's not the answer at all. That's not what you're deserving of it. You're deserving it because for 400 years you suffered under Egypt. Why? In order to bring about the demonstration of God's majesty, which is the Exodus from Egypt. And it only could happen after those 400 years of suffering. Because you think about it for a second. If the Jews would have been enslaved in Egypt for like a week, right? And then God would perform great miracles to redeem them, that wouldn't be too much of a demonstration, would it? Right? And it has to be that the enslavement is to the point where liberation is inconceivable, unimaginable, where the power of Egypt has been fully demonstrated. After all, Egypt has been able to hold these people as slaves for decades and hundreds of years, and after all that, God comes on the scene in 10 plagues, wipes them away. That's why you're deserving of it. If you're deserving of it for suffering, then there's no question. Who says they'll be deserving? It's not a question of deserving. You get it for suffering. That's why it's a covenant. That's why it's a bris. The question we asked, what are the Jews giving in exchange? It says, right, in the bris ben absarim, it seems that it's a unilateral promise on God's part. What are the Jews giving?
Suffering.
They're giving suffering. That's what God told Abraham. Yodoatei, that you should know. You have a question. You want to know why? How? This is the answer. The answer is for suffering. That's the bris. That's the exchange. It's not an exchange like bris milah, where it's an exchange for the observance of the covenant. You get the reward of Eretz Yisrael. It's an exchange for your suffering. The suffering of Egypt, that is the covenant. You pay with suffering, in exchange you get Eretz Yisrael. Now the question is this, but if we earn it through suffering, so what could the conditions be that would cause us to lose it? But now the answer is very, very simple. It's so simple that really we should just close the books now and because you think about it for a second, it's obvious. What is the demonstration of God's majesty? Is because God performed these wondrous miracles, the splitting of the Red Sea and the 10 plagues, for His chosen people. For His chosen people. So what if we commit sins which are a total rejection of our chosenness? We are not God's people anymore. We are not God's people anymore. So our continued existence in Eretz Yisrael would defeat the very purpose. In other words, if we're only given Eretz Yisrael to demonstrate, look what God did for His chosen people, because if we bring ourselves to the point where we are not His chosen people, we can't be there anymore. Now, think about this deeply. We all do sins, correct? We all do sins. We talk during davening. We go to shul and we talk during davening. Now, that's a terrible thing. A person should not talk during davening. But a person who talks during davening, you can't say this is a sin which is an emphatic statement that I am rejecting my Jewishness. Not at all. I'm doing it in a shul. Right? I'm going to shul, right? I'm a proud Jew. I go to shul every week, every day, 3 times a day, and I talk while I'm there, right? It's a terrible thing. It's a disrespect, etc. But on the other hand, there is this ongoing identification of being a Jew, correct? And it's an amazing thing. You can be a very, very proud Jew and identified as a Jew, even doing a lot of sins. Now, you might be not as charitable as you should be, and again, you talk during davening, and a little gossip, and so on and so forth, but you're still identifiably Jewish. You still are clearly a member of God's chosen people. But what if you commit the sin of idolatry? Let's say you become an apostate. You give up your Judaism. You become an idolater. You begin to worship Baal. You begin to worship Ashera. You begin to reject God Himself. It's different. It's not just a big sin. It's a sin which, by its very nature, right, you are writing yourself out of the Jewish people. Right? You are not part of God's nation. So therefore, it works like this. God says, of course, I'll give you Eretz Yisrael whether you're deserving or not. Even if you've done many sins, you've talked a lot during davening, a lot of lashon hara, you haven't given as much stuff, you've done a lot of sins. But it's not relevant. Why? Because I'm going to give you Eretz Yisrael not for your merits, but for your suffering. But the whole idea of giving it for your suffering is because it's a kiddush Hashem, it's a sanctification of God's name, that God performs these wonderful miracles for His chosen people. But if you commit the types of sins which mean you are writing yourself out of being chosen people, that would be the only grounds for losing Eretz Yisrael. So now there has to be something that we do as Jews which connect us eternally and define us as being God's chosen people, that's the only way there could be a guarantee that even if we are exiled from Eretz Yisrael, we eventually come back. And what is that? That is the covenant of Bris Milah. That's the covenant of circumcision. Circumcision is the covenant which means that whatever we do, right, we still define ourselves as Jewish. And that's what Bris Milah is. And
as long as we do Bris Milah.
As long as we do Bris Milah. That's the covenant, right? That's why the fourth covenant is conditional on something that we do. It's conditional on doing Bris Milah. But that's what Bris Milah is. Bris Milah means as long as we practice circumcision, we are defining ourselves as being God's people. And therefore we can retain Eretz Yisrael. We can retain Eretz Yisrael because the miracles that God performs to enable us to stay in Eretz Yisrael are therefore miracles that He's performing not for some nation which is not His chosen people, but a nation which still remains His chosen people by virtue of the practice of Bris Milah. That is the third promise and the fourth promise. The third promise is a bris that our gift of Eretz Yisrael isn't because we're tzaddikim. We don't have to be tzaddikim to get Eretz Yisrael. We don't have to have more mitzvahs than averos. Right? Even if we have more averos than mitzvahs, we can still get Eretz Yisrael. Because we get Eretz Yisrael for our suffering, not for our merit. But there are certain sins for which we can lose Eretz Yisrael. And we can't lose Eretz Yisrael just because we are more sinful than righteous. Just because on the scale we have more sins than mitzvahs. That will not cause us to lose Eretz Yisrael. But what could cause us to lose Eretz Yisrael is the type of sin which disconnects us from being God's chosen people. The only way to guarantee that we remain connected is Bris Milah. And that's the fourth covenant. That as long as Klal Yisrael practices Bris Milah, as long as it's identified as Jewish, then we are promised that even if we're exiled, we can ultimately come back. And that's what the fourth promise is. It says, but b'derech hateva, if considering the losses that we've experienced, which demonstrates the determination of our enemies to destroy us, our very survival is super miraculous. Think about that, right? In other words, we've suffered so much, so many losses, so many casualties, and so many killings, and so much death. That means we know that our enemies mean business, right? They are not joking around, right? They are determined. They are very determined. And nevertheless, we've survived, right? In ways that are incomprehensible, right? That means that everyone knows that the Jewish people are God's chosen people, and God is protecting them. Doesn't mean He protects every last one, but that's a nation who continue to survive. That's the covenant of suffering. For the covenant of suffering, that's Bris Bein HaBesarim, we have Eretz Yisrael. But there's a condition. The condition is that we have to remain God's people. In other words, if we suffer not as God's people, it doesn't prove the point. We don't accomplish God's end in history. And that identification as God's people, that's the significance of Bris Milah. That's what the covenant of circumcision is. When we have the covenant of Bris Bein HaBesarim, which is the covenant of suffering, and the covenant of circumcision, those two are our guarantee that someday we will return to Eretz Yisrael.